Harmony, to start, I have to say this, that it's a pleasure and an honor to meet you in person. I read a lot of your writing, and I came across your work with this great excuse to talk in person. In the past few days, I've been going through all the many sources, accessible materials in your very long career. Oh. And I think maybe we can start with the most obvious question, which is being here in this living room in Brazil, in your third day. What are the first impressions? And then we go from there.
Yeah. Well, my first impression is were all the plants coming in from the airport, because the plants that we have in pots inside are gigantic here. Yeah. And the trees are very different, the trunks of the trees. So a lot of it was about vegetation originally, you know. I mean, I knew Sao Paulo was a big city, you know, like New York or something like that. Yeah. So my first impressions were the plants, the vegetation, and traffic. Okay. Okay. And then coming here to the space, we came here to the space the same afternoon that I got here. Yeah. And I had seen many photographs, and my friend Amy Silman had shown here. And so I know Amy's work, so that gave me a sense of the space. I mean, I had seen the space, but because I know the scale of her works, it all gave me a good sense. And actually, it's like I envisioned it, but better, even better. It's just a gorgeous, minimal setting. And I very much like the idea of a conversation between two artists. And it's a curated conversation for sure. But it's wonderful for me, and I like the idea of a conversation. It could be with somebody I know. I mean, you know, but even with somebody I don't know and from another country. And one of the things I'm finding out here, both with Ivens' work, but also going to exhibitions and seeing, you know, Beatrice's show opening yesterday at the Pinacoteca, was just how we're all limited so much by the countries and where we live that we don't know what's going on other places in the world. And while the social political conditions can be different, there are similarities or simultaneous things happening. And so for me, that is just such a luxury to be able to come and have this exhibition here in Brazil, because of course it's introduced me to Ivens' work, but also other work in Brazil and the Brazilian climate, the feel, you know. So yeah, but as you said, I've only been here for 3 days. So.
Yeah, and it's a sort of a blind date, no?
What?
It's a sort of a blind date with Ivens.
It's a blind date, but yeah, but I'm trusting the connection.
With a good matchmaker.
I'm trusting the matchmaker, exactement.
That's very important.
Working here with everybody yesterday, installing with Masha and Enrica and so forth. I mean, it just was, everybody was a team working together, because the work does speak to each other. Definitely. And so I'm only sorry that I don't physically get to meet Ivens, but I feel he's here.
He's very present.
He's here, I know it, he's here. But I think we would have liked each other very much. So
yeah, and it's interesting that you started to talk about the vegetation, and I think one of the things that always gets my attention in São Paulo. I'm from here, I live here all my life, but in the past 5 years I've been living abroad. So whenever I come back, I have a kind of renewed gaze on a very familiar places, and I think one of the very specific things about the trees in São Paulo is that they thrive.
They thrive, yes.
They thrive the concrete, you know, and then they create these very beautiful sculptural forms. I don't know if you already noticed.
Well, the forms are odd.
That they break the concrete and then they find a way to follow the light, which I think could be a very interesting relationship to the way you work, in the sense of, and like
also,
kind of
but also to the what's called high desert where I live.
Yeah.
Because the soil is very different. Plants do not grow easily there. These plants would not grow there.
Yeah.
But what does grow, it also is a survivor plant.
Yeah.
Because there's no water. It's dry. And I know it's dry. And the many people would think there's no vegetation, there's no green, but there is for those of us who live there. but it's only when I travel someplace where there's moisture in the air and the plants are growing like this that I really realize how dry it is. It's like just these dry pieces of fence posts out in the landscape.
Yeah.
And so I feel like I live in a survivor landscape in a certain way. But it's interesting that you also talk about that same thing here with the plants pushing up through the concrete, you know.
Yeah, so because then it becomes a battle in between.
Yeah, man-made.
Man-made, but also this artificial division between nature and culture.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think then it becomes a very clear visual metaphor. And I think it's something you could, of course, transform in many metaphors
right.
Can
but
see,
literally coming from underneath, as it's been covered over.
Exactly,
No, I agree.
And like to giving, like to claiming visibility. And I think it's something interesting to start speaking about. When I was like looking at the writings around your work, there's this specific expression that caught my attention, which is this idea of social abstraction. I would love to hear you speak about how this. What we see as a kind of like a monochrome, multi-layered, very worked on material pieces that actually the tip of a larger iceberg, in the sense of like, of course it has to do with your background, like biographical background, the kind of like struggles that you went through politically. So I'd love to, it's not exactly a question, but maybe we start talking about the tip of the iceberg and how this goes down.
Okay. Well, you know, it's while that's certainly a term that I embrace in relationship to the recent work, but I mean, for me, that does go back, and I would say that I began to have that kind of consciousness of that's what I was doing after I moved to New York, which was fall 1969. But then within the coming year became part of a consciousness raising group, and in that group meeting and it was a work group. We didn't have a name. Yeah. It was just a work group, and we supported each other's work. And most of us were visual, but there were a few writers in there, including one anthropologist. And only one writer stayed, and the group got smaller. But we met for close to 4 years talking about our work. Now, so as women writers, but mostly women visual artists, women, you know, before that, women artists didn't talk to each other. Women weren't important enough to have a conversation with. So we not only had conversations, but we began to take each other very seriously. Other women were important. What they had to say was important. We fell in love with each other. We fell in love with the lesbian brain, to quote Bertha Harris. And so we learned to use, in my group, the consciousness raising circle to go around as an armature or a form of doing critique where everybody had an equal voice. And it was. And so using that consciousness raising structure, it meant nobody could interrupt. Everybody had equal time. And then we would talk about the work. We would go to each other's studio. So they might come to my studio. I have whatever I'm working on the wall. And we talk about it. But it was with a consciousness. It's what we now call constructive criticism, but we didn't use that term then. But for me, constructive criticism comes from feminist criticism.
Of course.
So it was at this time, anyway, to kind of jump back into the work here, that I had moved to New York, and after doing from Minnesota, where I was doing very large geometric hard edge abstraction like the boys in New York did, and I did it very well, okay, if I do say so. And then, and I do, is that it kind of began to move into, I was actually doing P&D work, pattern and decoration paintings, mostly on paper, because in the interim, right before I moved to New York, I went to Europe and hitchhiked across North Africa. I did it in 1967 and 1969. And so, and I saw collections of so-called primitive art at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris and other places and in Amsterdam. And so it opened up a world to me, seeing all that other art, which we never got in the United States. We never got in art school or anything like that. Nobody talked about non-Western art. Nobody talked about crafts except to put things down.
The art world is very insular.
So that opened things up for me first, seeing all this other work from other cultures, And then being in New York at a time where there's a lot of experimentation going on in terms of materials and what you call art and so forth, a very energetic time in the downtown New York art scene. And then you have, which at that time was a period of, civil rights activism, anti-American Vietnam War activism. Stonewall was a few months earlier, and the beginning of the women's liberation movement. So all these liberation movements, and most of the artists were political, even if their work wasn't. Even minimal artists, they were political. The work they might have thought wasn't political. Okay, so there's that, and then of course, the feminist conversation was so much about giving value to women's lives and women's experiences and so forth. And so then that extended, of course, into materials and creative, what were gendered traditional women's creative practices. And that for me overlapped on this looking at works across cultures from my traveling. So the one and followed right on top of the other. So as we're beginning, and it wasn't just me, the scene among feminists in New York was not, for most of us, not essentialist like on the West Coast. It was a much more anarchic group, and we were all doing different things. But there was a lot of reevaluation of women's creativity and how women's creativity, be it painting or weaving or pottery making or whatever, often took place in the domestic environment because women didn't, quote, have studios.
Yeah.
And
something made in between the domestic work,
and exactly.
The free time kind of.
And exactly,
argument.
They didn't have time to do certain kinds of work.
Yeah.
So that kind of what was considered art and not art, while there was already a conversation in the air that was looking at that, we brought a gendered lens to that way of working. And it wasn't only just a critique of what museums and galleries said was not valuable. In other words, work by a woman or about a woman or her experience was not important enough for fine art. Okay, so it wasn't just looking at that, it was turning around by doing it, by flaunting it, And so my practice was part of that with other women, and one way of doing that is, of course, through imagery, and it could be different kinds of ways of looking at female or male bodies. It could be reevaluating the still life. There were women who were doing piles of dirty laundry or dishes in the sink as a still life, And then another was working with materials that related to women's lives and women's experiences, which is more where I went. So I had been doing pattern and decoration paintings on paper that came from textiles primarily, tile and other things, but primarily textiles. And then at a certain point, I just quit painting and just using the fabric, the cloth itself. But they were not fine textiles. Yeah. And so the initial ones were literally what I call rags from women friends. So I rarely have ever gone out and bought fabric to make art. It was always found, repurposed, had its own history that it brought. So
things that arrive with you through affection or through conversation. So
it
becomes kind of like relational materials.
It was a relational material. Yeah. It was in a time where there was a lot of general art world experimentation with materials, but I and other feminist artists chose fabric or cloth. We didn't use the word textile then at all. That's what's used today. We talked about cloth or fabric. Okay.
More mundane.
It was more generic. And not elevated. And we got it in different ways. So for me, because I grew up I think partially because I grew up the oldest of 5 children. All our clothes were what we call hand-me-downs and things. So for me to get old clothes from women friends, a worn-out T-shirt or a worn-out pillowcase, and to put it in my art, it was natural. It was a hand-me-down.
Yeah, so it became kind of like somehow the presences that this material carry on, they became matter themselves.
Well, totally, because materials all have their own histories, as we know, and those histories get carried into any artwork, whether they're fine art materials, they have their histories, or whether they're rags, whether they're throwaways. And so I liked taking, for me at that time, using fabric from that women friends, like the women in my group gave me, was a way of literally putting my life in my work. Literal, The other things that were important, I think, that come forward.
Also this idea of overlay, no?
Yeah,
it also
exactly.
becomes a collective, even though you're managing yourselves and making the decision.
It comes from the collective. From more, it's me, but it's more than me. Exactly.
The agency is divided, maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the other things that kind of are connected to what you're saying here, that come forward into even the work in this show, are that I start taking those pieces of fabric, and they're torn, they're ripped, they're already pieces, okay? And my way of working is additive. So I'm trained, as you know, as a painter, but most of my work occupies a space between painting and sculpture. So these are paintings, we call them paintings, but there's a lot of relief. The early fabric pieces that you know, the bags, okay, what were the bags? Well, partially, they were layers of torn rags, layered, which is painting is basically an additive layering process. Most painting, not all, but we know it's additive. The rags that hang down, you could think of as 3-dimensional brushstrokes. So they are layered, so it's about moving through time and space and layering, and it's about, even then, with those early feminist pieces, about building from the inside out. And that's true with the wrappings later, and it's one difference between the wrappings of my work and Ivens' work, I would say. I'm moving, definitely. He's using it in a more constricting way, and I'm building it. For me, it's about building out of self from the inside out, which kind of is a 3-dimensional enactment or performance of the personal as political. Okay, so that starts happening. So here's Harmony and her group with other artists. I do use a bag, which of course is a feminist image or iconography. At that time, men did not have bags. I mean, it was a different day. No earrings, no bags, okay? And so the bag, some of which existed, they were all already old bags. I mean, women are called old bags. You didn't go into a woman's purse. That was her private place, right? So I'm using that. It's a vessel, for sure, a carrier of meaning. And then I'm layering all the strips on it. There were a few where I actually made bags. There were a few small ones that are at the Getty right now in a queer show that have the hair of each woman in my group. There's a bag for each woman in that group with the hair of that woman on there, okay? But usually it was just rags. And I just simply, it was very process oriented, my way of working. So I've talked about materials and where they come from. But the way of working was just totally post-minimal concerns with materials and process. I would take the rags, maybe rip it up a little bit, dip it in cans of acrylic paint, throw it on the plastic on the floor. However it landed, that's how it dried. And then I would take them and layer them and tie them together and build. And so that idea of building a surface, the idea of layering and accumulation, physically and really, but also metaphorically becomes part of it, and the notion of connecting, tying together, attachment, connecting, and that notion of building from the inside out, you know, to be a whole, to making a whole out of the pieces, and because women's lives were so fragmented. That's what we were doing. We were constructing We were constructing
I think
whole
now it's
lives.
like listening to you speaking about the bag. I think it's an interesting thing that we can, the way that you're somehow talking about fragments and words. No, like the bag as a metaphor, the bag as a kind of like a derogatory expression,
Totally.
but also as a vessel. So things are never just one thing in your work, of course.
And I believe we can claim it
Exactly.
and use it to mean what we want it to use. And that would be my approach to labeling as well.
Yeah.
To not avoid labels, which many people want to do because they feel labels are limiting.
Yeah.
But hey, change the label, change the meaning.
Of course.
You know, so it's a
And
different
also
approach.
Can be an excuse for wordplay, which is interesting.
It gives just labels are limited, but they do give some information. You know.
Yeah, but I think I like labels. I like the hint.
You like
So
the label.
I think the idea of that I see a lot of your work in the sense of, like, for instance, we are talking and I'm having the privilege of talking to you, looking at your work. It's so interesting to see them live in the sense of, like, that it's very clear that some parts of them are unphotographable and untranslatable at a later moment.
Totally.
So it's, in a way, especially this, that is exactly very literally in between painting and sculpture.
Right.
It is a negotiation of presence. And I think, to me, what fascinates me about sculpture mainly is that it's something that you become aware of your size, of your presence, of your body, and also the options of the artist, and then it becomes a choreographical situation that you have to navigate.
Right.
And I think the way that you use, for instance, like the how you pierce the canvas and how you work with the edges, there's motion always, no? So it's kind
There's
of
always a lot of possibility. I mean, you don't know. This could be pulled down.
Yeah.
What does it reveal? It already, in this particular painting, which is called Flesh Fold, it's very, I often have an edge within an edge.
Yeah.
And it's very clear that there's a second piece of canvas on this. I let you see it.
Yeah.
There's nothing, no secrets.
No.
Okay. I let you see it. But the feeling is this could go up and stick, or it could get pulled down slowly.
Yeah, but I think you leave it open. That's what I think is fascinating, and is the opposite of macho minimalism, one could say, in the sense of, like, you make it very visible, the hesitation and the vulnerability, even though the choices are there. In the sense, like, no?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you respond that way. For me, all the pieces, whether it's the early fabric pieces or a painting like this, I think what I want most is, how does the piece feel on the viewer's body? So while they are about the body versus the figure, how do the pieces affect the body? I want the viewer to feel the work on the body before they intellectually think about it, you know. And I think my best work does that, you know, or that's what I try to do. And it doesn't matter if you call it sculpture or painting. I mean, it's, So I think when you look at the work that we would call, or most people would call, sculpture, it's very clear that it's made by a painter.
Yeah.
Okay. And vice versa. So it's just like, that's what it is. Okay. It is what it is.
Yeah. No, and I think it's very clearly, which is mine seems like a commonplace, but your work don't conform.
Yeah.
They don't fit boxes in the sense of, like, maybe so is
Well, I also think, I mean, this is, of course, now looking at it through a queer lens or something, but the fact that they occupy a space between painting and sculpture could be a third or queer space.
Yeah.
And that it is a fluid space that, you know, is not fixed. It's a fluid space.
Can be an and, not the or.
Yeah, it is definitely an and or plus, and but it can move around, and depends how you're looking at it, you know, that kind of a thing. But I think a lot of my work does operate in that space, and you had mentioned in some of your written questions the floor pieces from 1973, which grew out of the bags and the presences. And even, I have to say, using the word presence as a title was very intentional at the time. It was a total no-no, as you know, in terms of a male critical writing at the time, that the notion of presence or présence was gendered female.
Yeah.
Bad. That was considered bad. That's why I intentionally called them that. Okay. Yeah. So I knew exactly what I was doing. But to go on to the other work that with fabric that grows, and to go to these floor pieces which we can say reference or perhaps perform braided rugs.
Yeah.
They're not crocheted, they're braided. And, you know, which is a type of rug that's made for the domestic environment, pretty much. Braided rugs you don't find in businesses or industrial settings. And women do it, because again, it's using the pieces, the leftovers. A lot of times it was leftover fabric that was braided. I mean, now people go out and buy fabric, but it started with what was left, the leftovers, the scraps. And I was interested because I was coming out of materials and process and believing that materials, of course, and their histories bring content into what would be more minimal or formal work. So that one way of bringing content into abstraction is through the materials. A second way is how those materials are manipulated. Are they torn? Are they attached? Are they cut?
Everything matters.
Every single, so what you did with it mattered as much as what it was. So that consciousness came from feminism for me. I did not have that in Minnesota. That was the big breakthrough, and it's still how I approach my work today. So, okay, so let's go back to the floor pieces that to some people look like a braided rug. For me, they were, first of all, because I thought of them as paintings off the wall. What now is called expanded painting, but that term did not exist then. So they were about taking painting off the wall, putting them on the floor with nothing on the wall. So it wasn't like stepping back and stepping over the
subverting
art.
the idea of neutrality, you know, in the sense I think
so subverting neutrality, but also that context of, I forget, was it Ed Reinhardt or somebody said something like, oh, that's what you back into when you're looking at a painting out here. So no, this was it. On the floor, it's domestic, and it looks like a braided rug from a distance. It's when you get up close that you see that the scale is a little bit different, a little bit thicker, bigger, and the surface is partially painted. So a couple things about those works. First of all, the fabric at this time I'm getting from the streets of the garment district. So I could use a t-shirt you give me, but most of the fabric was knit, synthetic knit fabric that came from the New York garment districts that was thrown out. It literally would be the end cuts of, think of big bolts of knit fabric. It's the end cuts. So I was getting work that was in strips, found strips, long strips, which are perfect for braiding. Okay, we know braiding, and that's associated with needlework, needle arts, and women and craft and so forth. But and at that point, in the culture that I grew up in, men did not have long braids in the culture that where I lived in hometown Illinois, I can tell you. And so even braids, and of course I had braids as a young girl, many of us did, you know. But it wasn't about that for me so much.
And also about entanglement, no?
Huh?
Entanglement.
Yeah. Well, actually, braiding isn't entangling. It's very organized, actually.
That's true.
And braiding, so I'm using it originally because of its association with needlework, needle arts, and so forth, as a fiber technique. So I'm using it for those associations, which was a very gendered lens for sure. But what I begin to realize later, you know, is first of all, there are different kinds of braiding. But most braiding, or most braiding in hair, but most braiding in fabric, mostly, are the type of braiding is 3 strands, 3 equally thick strands of the same material.
It's very mathematical.
So for me, I begin to realize, oh, the braid is sexy. It's very lesbian. It's braiding 3 things of like kind together, and they touch on each other.
Yeah, surface.
Yeah, exactly. And so there is another kind of braiding where you can braid unlike things, but I often work in 2s or 3s or something like that, and I'm very interested in notions of sameness and difference. So what happens when you put things together that are of like kind? It automatically has a queer read to it.
Of course.
To us, but not to everybody. But that's that I work that way.
Yeah.
And or if I put different materials together, I'm interested in what's the friction, what happens when edges meet, edges of like kind or edges of different kind. So that could be different materials or the edges treated differently.
Yeah.
So for me, the braid, which I've used beyond the floor pieces, I use them there, and I literally, in those pieces, would start from the center. So I would get the fabric from the street. I would sit and braid the fabric. Then I would sit in the middle and start, and it's a spiral. Feminist, right? A feminist spiral moving from the inside out, again, taking up personal to political space. It's gendered material and process.
Linearity also.
But I'm also partially painting them, and I'm saying they're paintings off the wall. And they're not to be walked on, they're to be looked at, okay? And there's nothing on the wall. I mean, that makes the point, basically, that at that time. What was interesting is that I think the floor pieces were some of my most radical work I did at that time.
It still is.
For all the reasons. Yes, they hold up. They've been, and there's a lot of interest. They get shown quite frequently. They do hold up, but there was a radicality, and actually some of the writing and reviews of the time didn't get it, didn't like the pieces, even by some prominent feminists that would surprise you. They were too close to the line. They were too close to braided rugs. Too close. And so some close. People, it was too much. Now they would come around to it, but at the time, that was it.
But it's interesting that you say that because, for instance, when I look with my current lenses, I say departs from feminist, but I also see there's like a lot of like environmental thinking, the colonial thinking, that things that became, I would say, within the vocabulary of contemporary art much later. So
exactly.
It's this fact that you brought in that I didn't know, that you spent time in North Africa and like living with the communities.
Right,
like,
and I think that's one of the things I took. I did take the idea of accumulation, but you're absolutely right. Another thing I don't want to use the word took, but it was there in the work, for sure, was using whatever materials are at hand, because that's what people all around the world have done. So work with what you have.
Dealing with scarcity and transforming into something creative.
So that notion of working with what you have very much came from those trips. And looking at work in other cultures, that's one of the things that informed me. Exactly,
but if you think of the timing that you were doing, like with the consumer industrial thinking in the US, for instance, and nowadays when you look at images of the fabric dumps, I don't know if you ever saw this, which is very beautiful sculptural, tragic
whose
things.
work?
The fabric. The discarded from like fast fashion industry that are going, of course, thrown either in Ghana or in the Atacama
Where do
Desert.
they come from? Yes.
And there's piles of debris of the clothing industry that you can see from space. And when we look at it, it's just these big rugs of masses of
really? Oh, how interesting!
It is, but when you say like working with the debris of the garment industry, I don't know if it was something in your mind back
Well,
there?
I was aware
But
of
it's like shining, putting light, making the debris the most important thing, you know?
Well, I'm aware
another-
of that. That wasn't
Yeah.
the main thing for me, but I'm
Yeah.
aware of that. And I'm also aware that there were these neighborhoods, you know, where there were sweatshops where women were sewing garments and things out of fabric.
Yeah.
And who's working in those sweatshops? Women.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I had that consciousness, but I wasn't really making the work about that per se, you know. I'm mostly just working with my materials,
Of
you know,
course.
that kind of thing. But I'm aware of many of these associations, many of it. And to go back to my group and so forth, what we also learned at that time, because we met almost weekly for 4 years. And then we showed as a group at Nancy Hoffman Gallery in Soho. And I remember it was a kind of radical decision to show as a group because every artist wants a solo show, right? But instead of having a solo show at Nancy Hoffman's or something, we said, oh no, we want to show as a group because we knew the group discussions and the group process was so important to our work. And the way that we critiqued the work. And so at that time, I knew, as did the other artists in the group, that if somebody could come to the studio and spend 4 hours looking at what I put up on the wall and talk about it, there must be something there to talk about.
Yeah.
Like, that was a big, you know,
And we are still doing this.
because when I had male artist friends, because one of the rites of passage as an emerging young artist is you have your older artist friends that you don't come over to see your work.
Because a matter of validation, you
Yeah,
think?
yeah,
kind
and
of,
to show what you're doing and to get feedback and all of that. So I had male artist friends come over who will remain unnamed, but they would come over and they didn't, everything I was just talking about, all the content that I thought was in the presences and the floor pieces and the bags, they didn't see it. Yeah, they didn't get it. You know, their critique was formal. It was nothing about meaning.
Yeah.
And they didn't get it. And they would leave, and I'd have this like knot in my stomach.
Yeah.
I'd have my women's group over, and we would talk about the work for 4 hours. It was so different, so radically different. You couldn't avoid it. It was just very clear. So it was about supporting our work, but the support didn't mean that everything we did was wonderful. Like I said, we developed what's really what we call today as constructive criticism, which was not saying that something didn't work, but talking about why or what.
And getting rid of the competition also.
And doing kind of what we now call visual analysis of the work.
Yeah.
But doing that back then, even though we didn't call it then. So the floor pieces were the most radical pieces at that time because they pushed that boundary the most.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They deprogrammed many things,
right.
I would say, looking at them with
And now
the
in
current
some of
lenses.
these pieces, like the painting behind us, here, in much of the work, and some that you saw at the Whitney, I'm using coffee sacks. Well, that was a whole different thing, you know.
Yeah.
But they too came to me, you know, in a certain way, because I had an assistant who was working for me, who actually was initially getting credit as a student, and then I hired him afterwards. Well, he now manages a coffee shop. So he gets coffee beans in from all kinds of places, including Brazil.
Yeah.
Okay. And so but my drawing, what drew me to the coffee sacks wasn't really the history of coffee plantations, or it wasn't on that kind of social political level. It was more as just an ubiquitous material and the texture, because as a visual artist, we respond to a beautiful material, a texture, a color, or whatever.
Yeah, but it has a genealogy that you took into account.
And it too has its visual histories.
Yeah.
And so the coffee sacks, the burlap, it's really burlap. So it's really, I'm responding to burlap more than coffee sacks, you know. But that's where they come from.
Burlap is a beautiful word. I love this word.
And
this idea of like working with burlap.
Burlap. Burlap. Lap.
Yeah, because it's also layering, you know?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I think maybe we can talk about this piece that That's the most recent
Yeah.
that you smuggle in some Monique Wittig's words.
Well, like I said, that piece, Voices, which is fragments of text of Monique Wittig's essay, which is called Paradigms, What Have You Done With Our Desire? And it was in a book, Homosexuality in French Literature, or something like that. And as you know, I have just used fragments of her writing and other French feminists and Trinity Minha. And it was I mean, I've always sometimes used writing, but at that period I was looking at their work and using it because it was both poetic and political. So part of it is I'm responding to actually the feeling of the language, because they were all playing with language. But I'm taking fragments of their language, just like I take fragments or pieces of materials.
Yeah, there's no hierarchy.
So in the voices, they are both fragments of text and fragments of the material, in this case, old vintage linoleum that came from abandoned farm homes, farm sites, where the materials are left, but the people are from a domestic site, but the people are no longer there. So my feeling is the materials know the history of the place.
Of course.
And in this piece, the words are even kind of ghost-like. But again, it's about making a whole out of pieces, out of fragments.
Addition again.
Yeah, and addition, accumulation. Yeah,
and also an idea to, like when you look at the way that there are very conscious choices of what goes where, that you can see, but also I think to break, especially also with the four pieces, this idea of succession and linearity, so it's much more like thinking about...
What do you mean?
In the sense of like, you're dealing with ancestral timing and overlaps and not a consequential things, like this comes after that because of that, that I think is very Western and very manly. So I'm wondering how this, of course, to me, maybe it's me looking at the lens with my my readings, but and also the time. But I think what I can see is that you anticipated a lot of what is we discuss a lot in Brazil and South America. Also, this idea of unlearning, unprogramming, and decolonization in a way, because I think in this sense, Brazil and the U.S. have in common something that they are continental islands, in the sense that kind of the countries are big enough to retrofeed its own culture.
In and of their own geography, that they're like islands.
Yeah, exactly. And I think your work is deeply American, but not, in the sense that, if it makes sense to you, it's just a speculation.
Yeah. That's very interesting to me. I don't have that perspective, of course, because I can't get outside of it that much.
Yeah.
I can't get outside of it. All I can say is, because part of what you were also saying, and other people have said it too, that they're very aware of how, and I think it's true for better or worse, that everything that's in the work looks very decided, like it's there intentionally. And I think that's true, but that's not how I start to work. I do not make sketches. Work grows out of work, and all the work grows out of handling the materials. So what I try to do, doesn't mean I'm always successful, but what I try to do, whether it's with rags or oil on canvas or burlap or whatever, is I try to just not think too much, try to let accidents happen, try to let the materials do their thing.
Yes.
I trust the materials. See, I know they bring...
It's a dialogue.
I trust them. So if there's a rip or a tear, I tend to leave it. If there's a seam, I leave it. I don't think about it too much. I just keep it because I like it. And then it's there physically, okay? And I try to just leave it open, to not censor it, to not be looking at it from the outside, okay? And then after working for a while, or maybe at the end of a day after working 4 or 6 hours in the studio, I sit back and I look at, what do I have here? And then I go like, oh, I have a seam. I put 2 things of unlike kind together or like kind together. What does that call up? What does that mean?
Yeah.
Or, you know, or I put the straps around the sides of a canvas. So the straps are no longer binding, but they're embracing the painting body.
Yeah.
Well, what does that mean? So I get to that when I sit back and look,
Yeah.
not while I'm working.
But that's what I'm saying, that is not linear, but also, for instance, maybe it can sound like a bit of a stupid example, but it makes sense. Playing tennis.
Well, I don't play tennis.
But when you play tennis,
you respond.
You respond quickly.
Yes.
So it's like kind of impromptu
bodily
decision making that comes out of technique.
I understand that, and
but you don't really think, but you know, in the sense like, you know, the ball is coming and you know it's a short, it's a long, or whatever, but it's not something that...
I know that from my study of martial arts. It's exactly the same. So it's all based on technique.
So my hint is accurate.
Yes, so it's all based on technique that you forget. You're supposed to, then you forget it and you put it aside, and yes, you just move forward.
Yeah. So
or whatever, backwards, whatever
is necessary.
That's
exactly what I'm calling unlearning, you know, because to unlearn something, you have to learn before.
Unlearn before, right.
Yeah.
So for me, but it is also a struggle because, so I embrace, no matter what materials I'm working in, that trying to be very open and fluid, to not do what I always do, to let the materials speak, to create what I call wonderful, to create situations for accidents.
Yeah.
Okay.
Inducing.
Yeah. So to create a situation where something can happen that is out of my control. And then, but then in terms of what do I leave, what do I change, what do I take out, what do I put in, that is where the total control comes in for sure.
Yeah.
And so, and I think that's why I know one critic who came to my studio said the works, because of the materials, but also what I do with them, are in conversation with work by other artists, for sure, a lot of other artists, but they insist that you approach them or relate to them on their own terms.
Sure.
And I think that's true.
Yeah.
You know, in some way, I don't know, but it feels right. Yeah.
Great.
One of the things that you mentioned in your writing was the difference between what I would call social abstraction versus work that deals with the figure, you know. And I think that's the difference for me between the figure and the body. I mean, I like some figurative work, but for me, the figure, illustrating the figure, the figure is held in by its contours, you know. And the body in and of itself is a social site.
But then it depends from external gaze, for instance, like
I'm sorry, what?
Maybe the silhouette, the figure, requires an external gaze, and I think the bodily experience is more like the first person.
Right, and I mean, and there's contours, there's edges, they're defined, they're defined, you know. And so for me, it's just it's a limited, I mean, there's some work that we might say is both figure and body, but generally speaking, I'm not, and I've worked with the figure a little bit, but it doesn't interest me so much.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in pushing and dealing with the notion of the physical body and therefore bodies, you know, because it's a bigger site that has agency and also gets acted upon.
Yeah.
The two.
Yeah. So I think we spoke a lot about your part of your work, which is what materializes as so-called artworks.
Yeah.
I would love to hear more about maybe building institutions, writing books, teaching, the other aspects of your practice. So maybe we start with Air Gallery and the shows you curated.
AIR, you know, like I said, I was very lucky to be in the right place in New York, Lower Manhattan, in 1970. And AIR really grew out of the fact that at that time it was nearly impossible for women artists to have gallery representation. I mean, you weren't getting into a museum show if you didn't have gallery representation. So if you were a woman and you took yourself seriously as a practicing professional artist, it was still very hard to even be in an exhibition at a gallery, much less have gallery representation.
Yeah.
So a handful, 2, 4 women just said, fuck that, you know, we'll make our own, we'll make our own. And they started going around and looking at work by other women artists, because that's what we were doing that was so radical at the time, was we were looking at work by other women, or just work by women, literature or whatever. To buy a woman's book was considered a political act. And if you could buy it at a woman's bookstore, even better. That was all a political act.
So it was a requirement of institutionalization as a weapon somehow, you could say, no?
Totally. So we began looking at women's work, and that's how AIR, you know, began. And the first women that started it, there was pretty much a core group of 4, went around and just started going to other artist studios to see what was out there. And from what I understand of the history, that they weren't even necessarily looking for some definition they had of feminist art. As they put it, they just wanted good work.
Yeah, and a meeting point, no?
An
open meeting point, which is, I think, is crucial for this kind of...
Well, that's what they were at the time. It's interesting. So, for instance, if you look at the work by the original 20 women, a lot of it was very material-based, because I wasn't the only one coming out of post-minimal concerns with materials and process. There were a few artists that were figurative, but they all did, you know, a representational, but we're looking at Judith Bernstein, or we're looking at Nancy Spiro. So, you know, it's not traditional academic painting, although that was going on as well from a feminist lens. But that's not that's not the work that was in AIR gallery. AIR tended to be more minimal, more materials-based, some figurative work. Interesting, no photography. At that time, photography... I was about to ask
if you had some overlap with like Barbara Hammer and also the experimental film people.
No. Well, I can't say they did. I don't know if they made a decision not to have photography, or it just wasn't happening yet. But photography at that time was still fighting to be recognized as fine art also.
You know, so experimental
and
film
video
as well.
was very, very new. So some of the artists, like Howardina, or Nancy Kitchell, some of the artists go on to include photography or video in their work with time, but that was not their primary identification when we formed. Anyway, there were a lot of decisions. The gallery took, you know, well over a year, almost 2 years to form, because everything had to be done in a collective process of going around in a circle, so it took forever. We fixed up a space, so we found a space, we fixed up the space, it was a co-op. There were 2 women's cooperative galleries in New York that had lasted for a short period of times historically, but we didn't know that at the time, and that's actually very recent research has proven that. But at the time, we and everybody else thought we were the first women's cooperative gallery, certainly in New York, maybe in the country or something like that. And what's interesting to me about that time, if you look at our initial brochure in literature, is we're talking about labels. We identify as a co-op of women artists, not feminists. Isn't that interesting? We all identified as feminists, but it meant something different to each one of us.
And it was not only queer women, it was women.
Oh, hell no, I was the only one. Oh no.
Because it makes a difference.
But just feminism meant different things to different women, especially in New York, East Coast versus West Coast United States.
And also Europe, European feminism was in a different
Right,
situation.
now one of the things that is interesting is AIR, which gets not-for-profit status and so forth, funding, because at first, I should just say everybody, oh, it's a women's gallery, it's not going to be interesting work. Well, it was interesting work. You know, everybody came to the shows because it's what was happening. And the work was interesting. You know, we'd all been working, unlike California, where artists were coming out as feminists and artists at the same time, we were already practicing professional artists. We were not coming out as artists. We were
Okay.
coming out as feminists, okay? And
Interesting.
so,
The order
yeah.
is very
so
different.
it's different, and that's
Yeah.
why on the West Coast it's more of a student-teacher relationship. On the East Coast, it was feminisms, plural. Okay. So AIR, which is like a radical gesture that we take ourselves seriously to make this time, space, pay to go into a co-op, actually call ourselves women instead of a women's gallery instead of a feminist gallery. And it's because we could not agree on that, you know, because to say you were feminist was just such a challenge. It was, at the time. And so we took the safe route, and we were a women's gallery, and even saying we were a women's gallery, everybody knew we were feminists and called it a feminist gallery.
Yeah.
And it was years later, if you look at the brochures from AIR, it's years later before they identify as a feminist gallery. It's just an interesting little bit of history.
Interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, what happened is, of course, the work was really interesting. Most every show got a lot of critical attention, written about, and when your work's written about, first you have to show the work for it to be seen. You know, it's about showing in those days. It wasn't about selling and market. It was about showing, the verb to show.
Yeah.
Showing the work. When the work is shown, people see it. When they see it, they talk about it. It affects them.
And they exist.
It might get written about. I was lucky. I don't have a graduate degree, but I was lucky.
Me neither.
Hello.
Yeah, rare.
and no, there are others like us, but
Dropouts.
I just know I never had the economic opportunity to do it, and so it just never entered my possibilities of my life. But what was interesting is early on, once AIR was there, once I had a show, and once there was writing in the art magazines about it, then people knew my work.
Yeah.
So then I began to be invited as a visiting artist to come and do an artist talk. And as I was telling Rika earlier, or somebody, the first talk I ever gave was at the Art Institute of Chicago, and I was a last-minute stand-in for Vito Acconci, who canceled. So people came to listen to Vito, and they got Harmony. Okay.
Lucky them.
Yeah, but I was there for a month, and I met a lot of the Chicago artists and so forth. So I would say maybe half a dozen of us in New York, both critics, but also visual artists, were fortunate enough to be able to travel around the United States to see what women artists and feminist artists were doing around the country. And we all, when we went and we did talks about our work, I mean, I did slide talks on the work of all the artists in AIR, of other feminist artists that were not in AIR. And in those days, of course, the art history departments were all 35 millimeter slides, libraries of 35 millimeter slides. The work in these slide collections was nearly all male, and if they had an O'Keeffe or something in it, it was always a black and white slide, because it wasn't really important.
Exactly.
So
you felt like making kind of like a database response to the usual, oh no, they aren't there. They're not, they don't exist.
If there were women, they would include women if they knew if they were out there.
Yeah, exactly.
But you see, the women who formed AIR, there was also a women's art slide registry. They looked at the slide registry, then they chose artists to go to their studios. So this network was forming. Part of the network then was when myself and some of the other women went and traveled to other places in the country, we brought all the slides of other women's work, and the slide librarian was nearly always a woman.
Yeah.
And I would say, they would pay
hijack
me,
it,
they would pay me for one talk, but I would give them 2 or 3 talks. There were no women's studies departments then. I would find a group of women, and could be on campus or not, and I just share the work.
Yeah,
just
opening pets.
And so I know that talks that I gave in Chicago after AIR opened helped. There were 2 feminist galleries that opened in co-ops in Chicago. And I know AIR was sort of the mother of them.
Yeah, that's
and that
beautiful.
I participated because of my talking and bringing slides, and because the the woman who ran the slide library was a woman. I would say, if I leave you the slides overnight, you can copy them, duplicate them, and put them in your library if you want.
Hijacking.
So we entered in, we all did it. We all entered in. We all brought other women with us.
Amazing.
And we inserted the work by women artists into those collections.
Thank you.
Yes. And I mean, you know, very consciously and intentionally, we learned real quickly. We're quick learners. We learned to do that very quickly. And we began to build a national network that way. So by the time I get to writing lesbian art in America, and there's not research to be done because there's very little written, right?
Of course.
Which is why I wrote that book, because there's nothing out there.
Somebody needs to do it.
Somebody needs to do it, right? There's very little out there. But I had a national network of girls, right?
Yeah. So the book is a consequence of this mapping.
It's a
database,
it is, and so I had,
circuits.
you know, I knew lesbian artists in Chicago and LA and, you know, Colorado, and a tent that I stayed with in Montana or here or there and different things. So it still was difficult, I might say, but that groundwork had been laid through the visibility and the privilege of talking and traveling that I got from that visibility, and that came from AIR.
It's amazing.
And that came from women taking space.
Yeah.
Not getting it, taking it, making it.
And also this performativity of an institution that becomes an institution, which is always quite interesting.
It's always interesting that what is the alternative spaces that become institutionalized or grow or become mainstream.
Yeah, totally. Like they have to have the muscle to navigate and to be considered something worth it to invite. No? Yeah.
AIR is interesting because it still exists today.
Yeah.
And I'm now over in Williamsburg in Brooklyn. But one of the things I've watched over time, because as you referred to, I do teach, and I, by the way, I consider teaching to be part of my political activism, which it definitely is. But AIR, you know, was started as an alternative to the system.
Yeah.
What became very interesting to me over time, and it has to do with this change that you just talked about, is that eventually AIR helps women within the system. So that if you're a practicing professional artist at a university, in the university art department, if you join AIR, because you can, it's a co-op.
Yeah.
You pay your membership, you get to have shows in New York, that goes on your resume as you're going up for promotion and tenure.
Yeah, it's a sort of mutual aid situation.
So it helps you get tenure.
Fabulous.
It helps you be part of the system. So it kind of changed to me, I'm from the outside now, but I'm looking, and I know that's not true for everybody, but I would say one of the main functions, because, you know, AIR is not considered sort of cutting edge in that same way that it was when it was formed, but it has a role, a very important role that it plays.
Social function, and also this idea, if it's the correct word, of mutual aid for women artists, which is quite
totally, and there's
like a toolbox for starting point, a toolbox.
There's a way.
Which is very political.
There's a way, and also, I mean, there is just that history, but to go back to the notion of just to show, the verb, to have a show, and for, I'm going to say, emerging artists of any age, even say in Williamsburg today, it gives them a place to show their work, and in a co-op, you can show what you want, how you want.
Agency, yeah.
How you want, what you want, how you want. It's up to you, it's your space. And you can create the dialogue around it. And so to this day, it functions that way, so that an artist who's maybe having a show for the first time, she shows it, and she can bring people there to see the work. It's very important, especially for artists who live outside of New York.
Definitely, yeah, because New York still has this validation
Well, and it's showing it, it's not just showing it to curators or dealers, but other artists, you know, because a lot of it is all about artists seeing each other's work, you know. So that's AIR. What began to happen for heresies later, by the mid-70s, there was kind of what we call cultural feminism taking over, and it was kind of like just a lot of getting a piece of the pie instead of changing the pie. And so it was wanting a more political analysis of the situation. And so a group of women, again 20 as it turns out, came together, but some were writers or anthropologists and so forth, and only some of us were visual artists. And
it was transdisciplinary from the start, which is also something groundbreaking.
It is, and what we did is we just put a call out, but it was New York based, put a call out, and anybody who wanted to come could come to a meeting. And part of the idea at that time, because we were unhappy with cultural feminism, was what do we need? What do we want? And the idea was we need a space and we need a voice. And we know in a certain way, Woman House in California had that space and so forth, but we did not have a space, really. There was a thing called the Women's Inner Arts Center, but it didn't really function in a big way. And so the notion of a voice and a space, the space, so 2 projects came out of that. A lot of women came to the earlier meetings, and some of them, it meant a big commitment of time. Didn't want anything to do with it, they left. So everybody self-selected. And there were women who formed the Feminist Art Institute, which had classes by women for women, okay? And I taught there a little bit. And, you know, it was an alternative space and so forth. But heresies became the voice. Heresies became the voice. And the 20 of us that were called the Mother Collective of Heresies, some of them came from very left political backgrounds. Some, I mean, we all were very different. And I and my partner at that time, the performance artist Marty Pottinger, were the only 2 lesbians in the Mother Collective. The Mother Collective formed the magazine and made very important decisions, like there would be no advertising. There would never be one woman's work on the cover. We were not interested in merchandising the work of individual feminist artists. So you don't find that you know, you don't find a Harmony Hammond or a Pat Steer or a Miriam Shapiro on the cover. They're not. You might be able to dissect the hand of a mark or something, but it's not an image.
It's how you put it.
And there's not. The only advertising are exchanges with other publications. And I should say that that was international. And in fact, AIR, I didn't mention it, got funding and did some international exchange shows with a French feminist art collective, I think Italian. We were very aware of the French feminists, the British feminist artists, and interesting big feminist art groups in Australia and New Zealand. And we all exchanged posters and publications. And we also, some of the publications that we did exchanges with weren't art, they were just leftist publications. So when you look in the back of Heresies, there's ads, but they're all publications and so forth. So those kinds of things were political decisions that took hours to make, of course.
Everything matters as the materials in your
and that's really, you just said it. Everything, you just said it. Everything mattered. It was blood, sweat, and tears, every one of these decisions, because it so mattered. Because we had a consciousness. We used the word revolution. We had the consciousness of what we were doing would make change.
It did.
And it did. So heresies, then one of the other things that the Mother Collective did was to decide, we decided to be a quarterly, put out 4 issues a year. That was crazy. That was crazy. But that's how we started out. And the idea was that each issue would have a different theme. And therefore the cover would be different, the look would be different, and it would have a different editorial collective that could be anybody from the outside. We were wide open to being subverted, you know, to have government plants or whatever.
Yeah.
And so it was a new group of women who maybe wanted to work intensively on one theme, but didn't want to work on the whole magazine, which was year after year, a very different type of time commitment.
Yeah.
So it could include women who are not part of the collective, but we always had one or two women from the mother collective on there, so we weren't reinventing the
But you're also
wheel.
reinventing a form of governance, which you also fight is a part of the revolution, no?
Well, everybody brought these different things.
Everything matters, including the governance, which is also
including the
back
government,
then not a
including the
given.
government, and then, like I said, a lot of the women came from the left. And you know, these were the days. I mean, this is all pre-internet, pre-computers. We were doing paste-ups on boards, learning how to do physical paste-ups of pages. Designers, in fact, Amy Silman, who showed here, came as a young woman student from Chicago and learned to do, and she worked as a designer first on some of the issues of heresies, because she took a class from Mae Stevens at the School of Visual Arts, and it was like a network, you know, of women that way. But the idea was there would be, so the concept of heresies, of course, is that there can be, it's about dialogue and discourse, and actually difference. We never believed it wasn't like everybody had the same notion of feminism or feminisms or whatever the subject was going to be, women in architecture, traditional women in traditional arts, the lesbian art issue or something. And so the biggest seller issue was the Great Goddess, though.
Okay.
But the lesbian one was, I think, second or something like that.
Oh, that's
so,
good to hear. Still.
So anyway, so those issues, then we decided what the theme would be, but then how the theme was developed was with editorial collectives that included non-heresies women and a couple of heretics.
Amazing.
A lot of the people we worked with who did typesetting or had to help actually make the physical magazines actually were doing left socialist pamphlets and things like that. So, you know, our connections in terms of how to make a magazine came from the left, basically. And so I was lucky to be involved and to work on 3 different issues: the inaugural issue, the first issue, and then the lesbian art and artist issue, which never would have happened except Marty and I were on the initial collective, and we made it happen, you know. And then
it's even harder to be a lesbian woman.
Well,
among women.
Well, there were other women. It was interesting though, because there were other women who had, I don't think at the present, but had lesbian relationships, but did not openly identify that. It didn't even identify, it wasn't about open, they just didn't identify that way, but they had lesbian relationships. And as we know, it was happening all the time, right? So, of course, so there was all that happening. However, to do the lesbian themed issue of heresies was so difficult because there was nothing out there again. Yeah. And so why do we have a map of Lesbos on the cover? Mm-hmm. You know, because we had to go back to history. Why are there no more women of color in that issue? Yeah. Oh, they were asked, but to be a lesbian and a woman of color, they would say, I can't do it.
Too much.
It's too much. I can't do it. We know who they were sleeping with. We knew their politics. We knew their art. But we're sleeping with them. Yeah. But they could not do that publicly. Yeah. And so that's what gets missed. That's what gets missed. And I think it's so hard for historians who are doing research, because I have PhD candidates who come back to me now and they're doing a thesis on the lesbian issue of heresies, on one issue of heresies. And they're doing a rigorous visual analysis of the issue and textual analysis. What's in there and what's not in there.
Yeah, because
it's good, and it's good, it's accurate, it's good. But what they don't get, and it's so hard to get, is what happened at the time. There's complexities, there's layers, there's contradictions.
But it's a privilege to be openly gay until this day. It's a matter of context, it's a matter of how you look, how you navigate. Right.
So it's very hard, say, for a young historian today who's done all their homework and is looking at the issue through a very good lens, I might add, but it's just, I don't know how you ever go back and capture the moment and the complexities of a moment. So it's very interesting to me. And then I worked on another issue later called Women Organized, Women Divided, Power and Propaganda and Politics, I think was the name. And so, so that was kind of revisiting after we had postmodernism come in, sort of like. So anyway, that did not, what's interesting, because you and other people have asked, working collectively, like on heresies, did it directly affect my solo work or my individual work? And I don't think so. It's like a really interesting question, and I don't know if I've even really gotten to the answer, but there's nothing direct about it. Certainly we saw each other's work, individual artwork, art practice. We valued women and what they were doing and what they were thinking, but I can't say that there was anything about the collective practice of heresies. In other words, some artists might have taken the idea of collective practice into community practice, and that the community practices their artwork, but that's not true for me. I like being alone in my studio working. So for me, I love being alone in the studio.
One thing doesn't exclude the other.
Right, and that the political work, be it protest or making a magazine or a gallery or teaching, is outside, but I bring the outside in, and I like to think that I bring the inside out. So that's just kind of the way it is for me, and I can't think of anything specific. Maybe Alex over here can. It's so maybe someday I'll come up with that. But certainly those early, but unlike we started the conversation, the early conversations with women, and we're all looking at each other's work, and we're talking about meaning in the work. We're talking about content. We're talking about meaning.
And also purpose, no?
And that was what was radical, but I can tell you, in college and in a painting class, you don't talk about me. I was making, as a student, large figurative paintings. They were hermaphrodites. Nobody talked about it. I didn't talk about it. They didn't talk about it. Nope, never mentioned.
Just about form,
no.
color choices.
Breasts and penis, we never talked about, no. So that was it. We talked about push and pull. Okay. So that was, I think, for me and many other feminist artists of my generation, was the insistence on content in work, of course within abstraction as well as figurative work, but also gendered content. And of course, then you can then extend that to content of other disenfranchised or erased voices, or queer voices, or queer abstraction, and blah, 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 all of that. So I think I still deal with many of, when I think back, I think the threads in my work remain the same. I think I deal with a lot of the same issues.
You're still dealing with pressing issues to this point.
So I deal with similar concerns, but the way that they physically manifest themselves are different. And now, even though the work still occupies a space between painting and sculpture, it's usually more presented as painting, definitely, And I like that, because I bounce off of it. It's, it's something to have a friction about.
Have a flickering definition. I think it's very queer.
So,
great.
So what else?
So maybe we can keep this conversation running forever, because it's a pleasure. Just to wrap it, I have a very straightforward question.
Okay. Oh dear. What?
How do you know the work is finished?
Oh, that's always a question.
Yeah.
You don't. I mean, in a certain way, I kind of have, I actually am going to quote a male artist on this, Bruce Nauman. Okay. But I'm in total agreement. You're at a point and there's nothing else to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like that. There's nothing else to do. And I can elaborate a little bit. It's just that I would say most of the time I do know. Mm-hmm. Occasionally you don't, or you're wrong. Occasionally you go back into a piece, but I don't usually do that. And it's just somehow, it doesn't need anything more. It says what you want it to say. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the work has to do that. And it does have to have that notion of presence for me. And again, I go back to that old bad word of presence.
Very important, especially these days.
But what is presence, okay? And to me, presence means occupying a space that is larger than a physical space. So whether it's a rectangular painting or a sculpture out in space, it has to do that.
Immanence.
It has to do that. And I think, this will be provocative to some, I think it's harder to do in painting.
It is. I tried to be a painter and I retired and became a curator.
Okay.
As they say, many have tried.
So that's kind of it. It has to have, but that's the art part of it. It has to have that something that is beyond the materials, beyond the physical space there.
Yeah, there's a magic.
Yeah, and there's nothing else that, you need to add. That's it.
Brilliant. Final thought.
Well, thank you so much.
3 dots. To be continued. To be continued.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you, Harmony.
Thank you
was
so
a
much,
great
Fernanda.
pleasure.
And thank you for good questions. Yes, yes.